He was already crossing the rope when the woman with the gold star pin saw him. She did not call out. She pressed the back of one hand against her mouth, the way people do when they cannot decide whether what they are witnessing is real, and she held that posture as the man in the khaki jacket stepped down from the low curb and planted both shoes on the black mat at the foot of the tomb of the unknown soldier. He did not look at the sentinel. He looked at his son, and he said, clearly enough for three strangers to hear, "See? The statue doesn't move." The sentinel's name was Grant Nguyen, and at the moment Ray Cutler's shoe touched that mat, Grant had been walking his post for 47 minutes. He was on his 15th turn when it happened. He did not stop. His head did not turn. His white-gloved left hand did not shift on the sling of his M14, and his polished toe cap continued its arc through the autumn air with exactly the precision that the ritual required. What no one standing on that plaza could read from his face was the weight of what he was carrying, and that weight had nothing to do with the rifle. The plaza in front of the tomb was not crowded on that Tuesday morning in late October. An overcast had settled over the ridge before 9 o'clock, pressing the temperature down to somewhere in the low 40s, and the thin gray light made the white marble of the tomb look almost silver. The wind moved across the ridge in low, even pulses, lifting a few brown leaves from the maple along the walkway and dropping them again, and the air carried the cold mineral smell of stone and the faint earthy smell of the lawn under the maples where the grounds crew had cut close the day before. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the perimeter of the plaza, a single car horn sounded once, and then was absorbed into the long quiet that the cemetery imposed on every sound that tried to enter it. The visitors who had made the drive to Arlington that morning had done so with deliberate purpose. They were not day trippers who had checked in a guidebook and ended up here by accident. They had come specifically, and the crowd's composition announced that plainly. Two men stood near the far left of the rope barrier, both in their early 70s, both wearing caps that carried unit patches from the Vietnam era. They stood with their hands clasped in front of them and watched the mat with the specific attentiveness of men who understood what they were looking at. A few yards to their right stood the woman with the gold star pin. She wore a navy coat and held a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she had not moved from her position in at least 20 minutes. 12 children in matching green jackets stood in a loose cluster near the center of the viewing area, kept in rough order by two chaperones who whispered corrections whenever the group began to drift. The children were quiet enough for a school group. Not quiet by any other standard, but not loud either. They watched Grant walk with the open and uncomplicated attention of people who are seeing something for the first time and have not yet decided what it means. Grant took 21 steps to reach the south end of the mat, and he had taken 21 steps to every end of that mat for the entirety of the 4 years' service that had carried him here. The cadence of the steps was slow and even, neither the brisk pace of ordinary marching nor the still slower pace of mourning, but the precise pace the regiment had established for this post, a pace that produced a footfall every 1¼ seconds, and that had become, after his first 6 months on rotation, the metronome by which his whole body kept its working time. He could feel the count in the small muscles of his calves, in the steady tension at his shoulders, in the way his breath had learned to fill on the 3rd step and empty on the 7th. The count was not ceremonial approximation. It was 21 steps exactly, measured by feet trained over hundreds of hours until the number had become something closer to a heartbeat than a calculation. At the south end he stopped, clicked his heels, and faced the tomb for 21 seconds. Then he shifted his rifle to his outside shoulder pivoted 90 degrees, and turned to face the other direction. He paused again, facing the crowd this time, and then resumed. The ritual was specific in every detail. The uniform was specific in every detail. Grant's dress blues were pressed to a crease that could have marked a ruled line on a drafting table. The wool of the coat had been brushed and lint-rolled and brushed again the night before, until the surface gave back the cool gray light of the overcast plaza, without a single fiber of disorder. The cap on his head sat at the precise angle the regiment required, the brim level, the visor breaking the light evenly across his eyes. The trousers held their crease down the front of each leg in a single unbroken plane from the seat of the trouser to the polished edge of the boot. His shoulder brass caught what light existed and gave it back slightly brightened. His white gloves had been cleaned 3 times in the 2 days before this watch, and there was not a shadow of a smudge on either palm. His shoes, black and lacquered to the depth of a still pond, showed nothing on their surfaces except the faint image of the marble in front of him. The chrome of his rifle's fittings was its own small mirror. Every visible surface of Grant Guyon in uniform was a surface that had received deliberate labor, and the purpose of that labor was not to be seen by the crowd. The purpose was to be worthy of what lay behind the inscription on the white stone. Ray Cutler had arrived at the plaza approximately 20 minutes after Grant's watch began. He had come with his son Marcus, who was in his early 30s and wore a gray pullover and a quiet expression that was not quite discomfort yet. Ray was somewhere in his mid-60s, a broad-shouldered man in a khaki jacket with a collar that was turned up against the cold, and he walked the way men walk who are accustomed to being the most confident presence in any room they enter. He had spent more than 30 years as a municipal contractor outside of Richmond, and he had spent those 30 years dealing with inspectors, zoning boards, and procurement offices in a way that had taught him one durable lesson. If you act like something is permitted, people generally let you do it. Ray looked at Grant for approximately 30 seconds when he arrived, with the kind of assessment a person gives to a stopped clock. He tilted his head slightly, said something to Marcus that the 2 Vietnam veterans, 4 yards to their left, could not quite hear, and then smiled. Marcus did not smile. He watched Grant complete a turn at the north end of the mat and start back south, and something in his expression settled into a careful neutrality that was different from his father's amusement. Ray turned toward the woman with the gold star pin, as though she were a companion he had just remembered. He gestured loosely toward Grant with one hand. "My son thinks this is serious," he said. His voice was not raised, but it carried. "Kid in a costume, far as I can tell." The woman said nothing. She turned back to the mat. Ray watched Grant complete another pass and then turned back to Marcus. "It's not like he'd actually do anything," he said. "These guys are trained not to react. That's the whole point of the show." Marcus looked at his father for a moment. "Dad," he said, and then said nothing else. Ray seemed not to hear it. The rest of the plaza continued its own quiet rhythms. The school group shuffled. The veterans watched. The Gold Star woman held her cold coffee. And Grant walked his 21 steps, turned, waited 21 seconds, and walked back. He had passed through this rotation often enough that his body carried it without the kind of conscious effort that exhausts a person. What his body did on the mat had become something more like breathing. What his mind did on the mat was a different matter. 47 minutes into his watch, just before Ray Cutler's shoe found the mat, Grant had been doing what he almost always did in the quieter stretches of a rotation. The body's discipline ran on its own schedule by then. The count of the steps fed itself. The shifting of the rifle from shoulder to shoulder happened on the precise quarter second The regiment had worked to make automatic. The breath fell into its long, even pattern. 3-second inhalation, 4-second exhalation. The cycle his lungs had learned across more than 1,000 rotations of this post. He was not thinking about the crowd. He was thinking about a morning in Kunar Province in 2019, and about a ranger named Derek Solis, who had been 23 years old. Derek had been the kind of person who made hard situations lighter without ever making them less serious. He had a way of looking at the worst circumstances with a quick, dry assessment that was not dismissiveness, but something closer to honesty. This is the situation. Here is what we have. Let's get on with it. He and Grant had served together through 2018 and into 2019. Two soldiers who had constructed the specific trust that forms not from liking someone, but from relying on them in the dark. In March of that year, on a morning much colder than this October morning in Arlington, Derek Solis had been killed in Kunar Province. The morning had begun ordinary, the dust of the staging area lifting in the dawn wind, the sound of distant goats, and the higher, closer sound of the platoon's vehicles starting up in sequence. Grant remembered the particular shade of the Afghan sky before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, a pale washed blue with a faint gray edge. He remembered the feel of Derek's hand on his shoulder at the briefing, a brief, steadying squeeze before Derek had moved off to his own position. He remembered the silence on the radio afterward, the long, flat silence that the operations channel produced when a name had to be said, and the speaker was working out how to say it. He was 23 years old. Grant carried a photograph of him. It lived in the left breast pocket of his dress coat, folded once, held flat against his chest by the press of the fabric. It was not regulation. Nobody from the regiment had ever told him to take it out. The photograph showed Derek grinning at the camera from somewhere in Afghanistan, the mountains pale and enormous behind him, his uniform dusty in a way that dress uniforms never were. Grant had looked at it the morning of each watch since the month he joined the old guard, and he had not looked at it the same way twice. He carried Derek the same way he carried the 21 steps, not because anyone required it, because the weight of it was the reason the walk meant what it meant. The post existed for the marble at the center of the plaza, and for the names that the marble could not list, and the names existed in the bodies of the men and women who walked the mat for them. And the mat existed because the names were real and continued to be real in the silence after they could no longer answer their own roll call. What no one in the plaza yet knew was that Ray Cutler had been building toward the rope line since the moment he arrived. He had done so incrementally, in the manner of someone who has learned that small advances are rarely challenged. He started behind the rope, arms folded, watching with the studied indifference of a man who had decided to be unimpressed. Then he moved to the rope itself, one hand resting on it, as though testing whether it would hold. Then, as Grant began a new southward pass, and the nearest park ranger had stepped briefly out of the line of sight, Ray lifted the rope, ducked under it, and stepped onto the plaza. Marcus said, "Dad, stop." Ray did not stop. He took 2 more steps onto the open stone of the plaza, and he was now roughly 4 feet from the mat, standing between the rope and the tomb in the space that existed for maintenance and ceremony and nothing else. He looked back at his son with an expression that said plainly, "Watch." Grant walked 21 steps south and stopped. He clicked his heels. He faced the tomb. He counted. Ray stood where he was and waited to see what the sentinel would do. Grant shifted his rifle, pivoted, and resumed his northward walk. His eyes moved over the plaza with the trained peripheral assessment of a combat veteran, and what they found was a man in a khaki jacket, standing 4 feet off the mat, where no civilian should have been standing. Grant's pace did not change. His expression did not change. His white-gloved hand did not shift on the sling. The crowd at the rope had changed in its quality. The school group had gone completely still. The two veterans had straightened. They stood now in the half-instinctive posture of men who had been taught, decades earlier, to recognize the precise quality of an authorized presence on consecrated ground, and to recognize when that presence was being challenged. The Gold Star woman had lowered her cup entirely, and her right hand had come up and closed over the pin at her lapel. Her fingers found the small enamel surface and held it the way a person holds a medallion at a graveside, with the pressure of someone whose hand needs to remember the object's existence in a moment when the rest of the world has gone unsteady. Nobody spoke. Ray looked back at Marcus and grinned. "Told you," he said. He turned toward the few visitors still watching and spread his hands wide, an invitation to share in the observation. "It's all theater," he said. "The soldier doesn't actually do anything. He just walks back and forth." This was the second time he had voiced it. The first had been half-heard, a private observation to his son. This time he offered it to the whole plaza, and it landed on the cold October air the way a coin lands on a tile floor, sharp and unnecessary and impossible to take back. Marcus had taken one step back from the rope, putting a visible distance between himself and where his father was standing. He was not gesturing, not speaking, not meeting anyone's eyes. He was simply no longer standing in the place that associated him with what was happening. Grant reached the north end of the mat and stopped. He stood facing the white marble for 21 seconds, with the full, unhurried formality that the ritual required. He counted the seconds against the steady internal pulse of his own breath. 1. The cold air entered through his nose in a thin, steady draw. 4. The wool collar of the coat held his neck warm against the breeze. 8. The weight of the rifle on his shoulder sat in the precise, balanced position the regiment required. 12. The hush of the plaza pressed against the back of his head. 16. The white marble in front of him gave back the gray light without comment. 21. In those 21 seconds, the plaza was so quiet that one of the school children, a small girl in a green jacket near the left edge of the group, reached up and took her chaperone's hand without being asked. Ray Cutler took those 21 seconds as confirmation. He walked forward 2 more steps, crossed the last of the open stone between him and the mat area, and reached out with his right hand and placed it on the post of the bronze wreath stand that flanked the south corner of the tomb. That was the line. The old guard protocol was not ambiguous about what a sentinel could do when a civilian crossed the barrier onto the restricted plaza. It was documented, practiced, and Grant had rehearsed it, the same way he had rehearsed the 21 steps, because the two were not separate disciplines. They were the same discipline. Grant had been placed at this post to protect the sanctity of what lay behind that inscription. And the sanctity of this ground had just been placed under a human hand that had no authorization to be there. Grant pivoted. He did not finish the turn in the standard rotation. He stepped off the mat, and his footfall on the open plaza stone made a single, flat sound that cut through the October air with the precision of a period at the end of a sentence. The plaza had not heard a sound like that one in any of the days that any of the visitors present could remember. It was the sound of a regulation boot striking the stone of the restricted area, and the sound carried with it the implicit fact that the boot had been authorized to make that sound, and that the man wearing it had been authorized to step off the mat for the precise reason now unfolding. He crossed the distance to Ray Cutler in 9 measured steps, came to a halt with his rifle vertical at his side, and stood directly in front of the man who had stepped over the rope. Ray looked up at him. He was still holding the bronze post. His expression had not fully decided yet whether to stay amused. Grant did not raise his voice. He did not lower it. He spoke at the same measured, level pitch that a person uses when they want to be understood precisely and completely. "Sir," he said, "your hands and your feet need to leave this ground right now." That was all he said. 8 words. The bronze post released before Grant finished speaking. Ray's hand came back from it as though the metal had delivered a mild electrical current, not because it had hurt him, but because the sentence had made it abruptly clear what kind of place he was standing in and what kind of person was now standing in front of him. The confidence that Ray Cutler had carried onto this plaza, the confidence that had built through 30 years of dealing with inspectors and zoning boards who could be waited out and permit offices that could be navigated and enforcement mechanisms that would eventually lose interest, came into full contact with a man who did not work on any of those systems and who had not looked at Ray Cutler's self-assurance with anything except the same measured, procedural clarity he brought to everything else on this mat. Ray took 2 steps backward. He started. He stopped. He tried again. "The post was right there. I wasn't trying to." He stopped again. Grant stood where he was. He did not pursue, did not comment, did not raise his hand. The rifle remained at his side, vertical, the polished butt plate inches from his boot. His shoulders held square, his chin held level. His eyes held on Ray with the absolute steady attention of a person whose only job in this moment was to be the unmoved fact of his own authority on this ground. He had said what was required. His posture said the rest. The plaza held its breath. Marcus Cutler, from behind the rope, had both hands in his pockets and his eyes on the ground in front of his shoes. He had separated himself by 3 feet from the nearest other visitor at the rope line, a quiet geometry that announced to anyone looking that he was not part of what had just happened. One of the Vietnam veterans, the taller of the two, removed his cap and held it against his chest. The other followed a half-second later. The Gold Star woman pressed her hand against the pin and kept it there. She said quietly, to no one in particular, "Thank you." She did not say it to Ray. She did not say it to Marcus. She said it to the marble and the October air, and the 3 words were the only human sound on the entire plaza for several seconds. The school group stood absolutely still. Not because anyone had told them to, not because the chaperones had given a corrective gesture. They stood still the way children stand when the world has just shown them something that was larger than anything they came prepared for. And the only sensible response is to stop moving. Sergeant Holt had been at the edge of the plaza for 90 seconds. He had read the situation from the corner of the walkway and the time it took for the second of those seconds to pass, and he had taken his current position on the edge of the open stone after the third, and he had spent the remaining seconds confirming the sequence of events through quiet observation. The man in the khaki jacket on the wrong side of the rope, the sentinel still walking, the sentinel pivoting off the mat, the sentinel speaking. By the time Grant said the 8 words, Sergeant Holt had already determined the form his own intervention would take, which was the calmest possible execution of an existing protocol. He came forward now with the unhurried purpose of a man who has seen how this ends many times and knows that arriving at a careful pace is both more effective and more appropriate than arriving at a run. He was the sergeant of the guard for this watch, and his uniform carried the specific gravity of accumulated responsibility at the cemetery. He crossed the plaza to where Ray had stopped, standing now about 2 feet back from the rope line on the open stone, and he stood in front of the man without ceremony. "Sir," the sergeant said, "I need you to come with me." It was not an invitation to discussion. Ray seemed to understand that, because he went. He did not look at Grant as he left. He did not look at the veterans. He looked at the stone in front of his feet, and he walked toward the walkway with the sergeant of the guard at his shoulder. And his son followed, and the three of them moved off the plaza with the quiet efficiency of something being resolved at a procedural level. What Grant did next was the only thing that mattered to this post. He walked back. He stepped onto the mat at the north end, brought his heels together, shifted his rifle to the prescribed carry, and began. 1, 2, 3. He walked 21 steps south in the October air, and the sound of his footfalls on the mat was the only sound on the entire plaza. The school group had not moved. The veterans had not moved. The Gold Star woman had not moved. The scattered individual visitors along the rope stood with the stillness of people who had come here as tourists and would leave having attended something else entirely. If you have ever stood at the tomb of the unknown soldier and felt the specific weight of a watch unfolding in front of you, you understand something about why that weight is so hard to name. It is not sadness exactly. It is not pride exactly. Take a moment to consider what it costs a person to stand guard over a grief that belongs to an entire nation, and then send this story to someone who would understand why that cost matters. Now, back to the mat. Grant reached the south end and stopped. He faced the tomb and counted. The wind across the plaza had risen slightly, lifting a single dry leaf across the open stone in a small, skittering arc that ended somewhere near the wreath stand. The leaf moved past the corner of his vision without his eyes following it. The count continued. The breath continued. The post continued. Behind him, the woman with the gold star pin had not moved. She had stood at this rope on a Tuesday in October 11 times across the past 14 years. She had stood at it through the heat of August visits and through the rain of late spring visits and through the bitter wind of January visits, and what she had come for was always present here in a way that was difficult to explain to people who had not lost the specific person she had lost, and that did not require her to explain it to be present. The tall veteran had his cap back on his head now, but he was standing straight in a way that was not his relaxed posture from 20 minutes ago. His companion stood the same way, stood. The children in the green jackets watched in the specific silence that arrives when 12 young people collectively decide, without anyone telling them, that they are in a place that requires them to be quiet. One of the children, the small girl who had taken her chaperone's hand during Ray's crossing, was reading the inscription. Her lips moved slightly over the words. She reached the end and went back to the beginning and read them again. Grant shifted his rifle to his outside shoulder, pivoted north, and walked. Sergeant Holt returned briefly to the edge of the plaza while Grant was in his third full pass since the incident. He did not interrupt the watch. He stood at the walkway for a moment watching the mat, and then he caught Grant's eye at the north turn and offered a single nod. Grant returned it, fractionally, and resumed his pace. No other communication was required. The procedural loop that had opened when Ray crossed the rope was now closed, and the institutional authority of the cemetery had confirmed, without speech and without spectacle, that Grant's response had been exactly calibrated to what the situation required. Ray Cutler and his son Marcus left the cemetery before 11 o'clock. The sergeant of the guard had explained in the measured language of document protocol what the penalty provisions were for unauthorized access to the restricted area and what would happen if the matter required further escalation. Ray had listened. He had not argued. He had not tried to deploy the confidence that usually served him in rooms where authority was negotiable, because the sergeant's voice had the particular quality of a person explaining a fact rather than making a demand, and facts do not respond to negotiation. When the conversation was finished, Ray and Marcus walked to the parking area. Marcus had not spoken to his father during the conversation with the sergeant, and he did not speak to him afterward. He walked beside him in the gray October morning with his hands in his pockets, and looked at the headstones as they passed. The two Vietnam veterans stayed through 2 more complete passes of Grant's watch. When they finally left, the tall one stopped at the edge of the viewing area and took his cap off a second time and held it at his chest for a moment, facing the mat. His companion did the same. They held that posture for approximately 10 seconds, then put their caps back on and walked toward the main pathway without speaking. The Gold Star woman stayed longer than any of the remaining visitors. She stayed through the end of Grant's watch, and she was still standing at the rope when the relief sentinel arrived at the mat for the changing of the guard. She watched the full ceremony of the change without moving. When it was over, she put her cold paper cup in the nearby receptacle and walked slowly in the direction of the memorial amphitheater, and her hand was still resting on the Gold Star pin when she turned the corner out of sight. Grant's watch ended at noon. He completed his final 21 steps south, paused the full 21 seconds at the tomb, shifted his rifle, pivoted, and walked the 21 steps back. At the north end, he stepped off the mat with the same deliberate care he had used for every step in the past several hours, and stood at the position he held when the relief rotation came. The changing of the guard ceremony at the tomb of the unknown soldier is not a handshake. It is a ritual that takes several minutes and involves the sergeant of the guard, the relief sentinel, and a specific sequence of inspections, movements, and verbal exchanges that have been performed at this post continuously since July of 1937. Not during the Second World War, not during Korea or Vietnam or the Gulf, or the years after 2001. The guard at this tomb has not been interrupted, and the ceremony of the change is a small, precise enactment of that continuity, performed in front of whoever is present to see it. The school group was still there for the change of the guard. The 12 children in green jackets had been standing at the rope for nearly 2 hours by then, longer than any planned visit to a single Arlington site usually ran, and the chaperones had elected to extend the visit on the unspoken understanding that the children were inside something they would not be inside again on this trip, and that the regular schedule could absorb the loss of the next stop. The chaperones had apparently decided to stay longer than planned, because 12 children in green jackets stood at the rope with a quality of attention they had not arrived with. They watched the ceremony with the focus of people who are still processing something that happened earlier and are not yet ready to move on from the place where it happened. Grant walked off the plaza and down the walkway toward the guard quarters. The walkway curved through a low hedge of holly that the grounds crew had trimmed against the cold, and the smell of damp stone and crushed leaves came up off the path with the sharper, clean smell of the autumn afternoon. In the changing room, he removed his dress coat and hung it with the care that the coat required. He checked the shoulder brass. He checked the sleeves. He took the coat to the proper hook and settled it there, and then he reached into the left breast pocket. He took out the photograph. He looked at it for a long moment. The fold along the center had begun to soften with age, the paper showing the faint pale crease of having been opened and closed many times across the months. The corners had begun to round slightly, in the way that paper kept against a body's warmth begins to round. The grin in the photograph had not changed. The mountains behind it had not changed. The dust on the uniform had not changed. Derek Solis, 23 years old, in the dust of Kunar province in 2019, grinning at the camera the way he grinned at most things, with the straightforward pleasure of someone who had not yet found a reason to do otherwise. What had happened on the plaza today, and what happened on every other day Grant walked those 21 steps, was not something that could be explained in a short conversation or defended in a public argument, and Grant had no interest in explaining or defending it. Ray Cutler had placed his hand on the bronze post of the wreath stand, and what that hand had touched was the edge of a vow. The vow was not complicated. It was just old and specific, and the names attached to it were real names, and one of them was Derek Solis, and one of them was written on the white marble in letters that could be read from the rope line on a Tuesday morning in October. Grant folded the photograph once along its existing crease and set it on the bench beside him. He sat with it for a moment in the quiet of the changing room. Then he stood, and he put the photograph back in the breast pocket of his dress coat, and he pressed the pocket flat with his palm. He would walk the mat again in 2 days. He would take 21 steps south, stop, count 21 seconds facing the marble, shift the rifle, pivot, and walk 21 steps north. He would do this for however many rotations his watch required, and he would carry Derek the same way he always carried him, and he would not think about Ray Cutler in any of those rotations, because Ray Cutler was not the reason the walk mattered. The walk mattered because of what was written on the stone, and because of the names that were not written anywhere, except in the memories of the people who had carried them here. The plaza was quiet now, in the way the tomb is always quiet after a watch ends and before the next one begins. The rope hung still between its stanchions, the brass clips at the stanchion heads catching a faint, dull gleam from the muted light. The bronze wreath stand caught a brief thin thread of light from a gap in the overcast and held it for a moment, the metal warm-colored against the cool gray of the stone behind it. The marble inscription faced south the way it had faced south since 1921, reading its 7 words into the October air over a city full of people who did not stop what they were doing when those words were first carved into the stone, and who would not stop today, and who nonetheless are offered the accounting of those words without having asked for it. The sergeant of the guard had told Grant, later that afternoon, that the unusual quiet on the plaza after the incident had been noted by 2 of the cemetery staff who moved through that area regularly. One of them had said it was the quietest he had seen that viewing area in at least 5 years. He had not been able to account for it fully. The crowd had not been asked to be quiet. No announcement had been made. The stillness had simply arrived, the way stillness arrives when a group of people has collectively witnessed something that reminded them of a fact they had not expected to be reminded of on a Tuesday morning in late October. The fact was not a secret. It was written in 7 words on the white stone, and Grant walked 21 steps past it every 90 seconds, and had done so for 4 years, and would continue for as long as his post required it. The boots went back to the mat, and the tomb said nothing, and that was enough. The rotation would continue. The next watch would be set. The names would remain where they had always remained, in the marble and in the bodies that walked the marble's perimeter, and the work would go on.